Hey, Cypher here. I don't know if I'm going soft or something, but it seems like as I started going through the backlog of movies for 2016, I kept finding good historical ones. Am I just losing my ability to drill into these? When is the anger going to well up again? Deepwater Horizon, the movie, is dangerously close to being a disaster, but it is safe, unlike what it depicts. One of the worst environmental catastrophes in history is the subject, and the crazy incident that made it happen. This movie honors the people involved without over-glorification. It does stray into some demonization, but not enough to hurt the narrative of what actually happened too much. I think most of us remember the overall disaster of the Deepwater Horizon, but maybe not of the history behind offshore oil drilling. That has been a steadily evolving technology for a while. The first oil platform was built in the 1890s on a freshwater lake in Ohio, with the Santa Barbara Pier rigs being built only a few years later. These early rigs all depended on being connected to the shore somehow. Some would even build up artificial islands. Stability was a concern for a long time. Until after World War II, rigs were built to the site, which limited the depth that anything could go. But then came the jackup rig. In 1956, the first one was operated by a company owned by George H.W. Bush, and successfully drilled offshore from Texas. From then, the stability problem was somewhat corrected, since you could just plop one of these down wherever you wanted. But they were limited in depth. You could only drill in waters as deep as the legs would go. There had been a competitor to the jackup rig, the fully submersible. They'd just sink a rig to the bottom and operate it safely from a platform above. But this meant they were very limited in depth. But one day in 1961, a submersible failed to be buoyant enough, and the shell company figured out they could operate the submersible while floating above and simply anchoring it to the bottom of the ocean. They made a success out of a failure, and platforms were off to the races. They began drilling at deeper and deeper depths. While all this was being done, a type of drill boat was made, which focused on drilling preliminary wells.
No, the Deepwater doesn't pump a drop of oil, okay? But I mean, we're the explorers.
These started off as regular ships that stayed in place by changing the direction of their propellers. These ships dug the well, but then switched off with a platform to pump the well. Eventually, they became the gargantuan ships that were almost indistinguishable from their platform counterparts. That is what the Deepwater Horizon was, a drilling ship with semi-submersible characteristics.
You know it's not on stilts. It's not jackup.
Yeah, I do, and I still can't believe that thing's a boat.
Now, we're aware that the Deepwater Horizon disaster, or Macondo, as the well it was digging was called, was one of the worst oil spills in history, but it was nowhere near the first time something like this has happened. Oil spills are a constant problem. The worst land spill happened in California in 1910 when a gusher dumped oil to form a small lake. Several Middle Eastern countries actually do this on purpose now. During the Gulf War, the next biggest spill was perpetrated by the Iraqis to purposefully hinder a coalition invasion of Kuwait, which failed to stop anything. A ridiculous amount of oil spills have happened because of transporting oil, such as the famous Exxon Valdez, which was so environmentally disastrous because of its remote location. In terms of drilling platforms, the Gulf of Mexico has had its fair share of disasters. For instance, there was the Ixtoc 1 spill in 1979, which was almost as bad of a spill as Macondo and was caused by a similar rig and outcome.
The reason the Ixtoc explosion turned into a massive uncontrolled leak 30 years ago is because the well's blowout preventer malfunctioned. Sound familiar? The drilling was being done by a company called Sedco. Sedco later became known as Transocean, the operator of the rig that blew up this year in the Gulf of Mexico.
Over near Australia, their worst offshore drilling disaster happened only a year prior to the Deepwater Horizon.
The West Atlas rig was spewing oil and gas into the Timor Sea for 10 weeks before it caught alight.
The Deepwater Horizon had actually been doing a superlative job before the disaster. She had drilled the deepest offshore well in history mere months prior. The crew was even given a safety award only hours before the disaster struck. There is a lot of research into how it was caused. There has been a lot of investigation into the 2010 Deepwater Horizon disaster, since it led to the deaths of 11 out of the 126 people aboard, and the spill was the worst accidental spill on water ever. Fault has been assigned. It turns out that a large device that is designed to stop oil from rushing up the pipe, called the blowout preventer, failed due to the inner pipe bending around where it could have been cut.
The buckling pushed sections of the drill pipe outside of the reach of the blind shear ram blades.
It gets fairly technical, but it basically works like...
And these mean old dinosaurs can't believe it, so they rush to the new hole. Then smack, they run into a big machine.
Blowout preventer.
They run into this stuff called mud
All right, get it in there.
that they cram down the straw. The mud's so thick and heavy, it blocks the monsters from coming up. And then they sail away to the next.
The problem was preventable. They had done some testing that showed a dangerous amount of pressure buildup, but it was theorized away.
There's something off with it. He says it's a bladder effect.
Bladder effect.
Bladder effect. He said.
A lot of mistakes were made, like the appropriate alarms were not triggered, safety equipment not being ready, and of course, just the cavalier attitude British Petroleum promoted in trying to save money. Once the blowout happened, in trying to cap the well, it took several tries before finally succeeding 3 months after having almost gone to using high explosives to burn it out. Though a few people were facing jail time over this, their cases were dismissed because blame was mostly focused on BP as a whole, leading to a fine of $18.7 billion, the largest fine in American history. A further $23.5 billion has gone to paying other lawsuits and fines, and another $58 billion in containment costs, making it cost BP almost $100 billion.
Okay then. We hold the world ransom for $100 billion.
Or approximately a third of the total money BP made in 2010 alone.
I'm Tony Hayward. BP has taken full responsibility for cleaning up the spill in the Gulf. We've helped organise the largest environmental response in this country's history. To those affected and your families, I'm deeply sorry.
We are deeply sorry. Sorry.
Just like most oil disasters in the US, the investigations have prompted new regulations and higher safety standards for the future in hopes of preventing another disaster. I had to simplify this a lot, so if you'd like to learn more, what I used to research this is linked in the description below, like normal. This movie intentionally focuses on the explosion on the Deepwater Horizon, rather than the blowout on the Macondo well as a whole. That way, it can avoid the messy politics of the oil spill and focus on the human drama. This is mostly effective. It tries to explain the science behind the blowout in a manner that the audience can easily comprehend. Some have said that it is a little oversimplified, but from what I've read, I think they did a really good job in that regard. The movie is exciting and well performed. We, the audience, learn of the often antagonistic relationship between big oil and the contractors who work these rigs.
Deal with it. You don't want to know if that cement job on this well is shit because you're 43 days and $50 million over budget. Point is, you sent the testing team home before they could do their job, maybe give y'all some news y'all didn't want to hear. You're a $180 billion company and you cheat.
That's why we're a $186 billion company. We worry about those bills.
The attitude of the workers and how they interact is said to be quite lifelike by the people themselves, and as a result is fairly entertaining. The action of the explosion and the last person to leave the rig, who really did have to jump from high up the rig, is a great finale. The heroics taken by his real-life counterpart, named Mike Williams, are certainly exaggerated, but the man is humble, and what the movie depicts is conceivable. In order to make this as realistic as possible, one of the largest movie sets of all time was created for this film. A mock-up of the Deepwater Horizon was made that's 85% the size of the real McCoy, a term that actually might originate of an oil invention, by the way. They floated this mock-up in a 2.5 million gallon water tank. So for the most part, they get things right in this film, and it benefits dramatically because of that. And for that alone, it is well worth watching. On the other hand, there are some inaccuracies that need to be pointed out. There have been complaints by fact-checkers that this film demonizes Donald Vidrine too much. The courts have found that his actions were on behalf of BP, and that he even called his superiors to verify what he was commanding aboard ship. Now, the film does make it seem like he is solely at fault here.
You nervous as cats, afraid to make it work at every turn. That will be my summary back to my bosses in London.
But that can be interpreted as him simply representing BP as a whole, just as he actually was. Where it does stray into demonization is the scene where they are trying to figure out why the pressure test is yielding such bad results. They show Vidrine as the one who proposes the faulty bladder theory. This was proposed by one of the Deepwater Horizon crewmen who died in the explosion. Perhaps the movie didn't want to speak ill of the dead, but blaming someone who already is facing serious international reproachment instead is worse and unwarranted. It also fails to show the mistakes of the crew, especially the failure to turn on the alert lights.
Magenta. Magenta alarms.
It does show Andrea Fletes struggling mightily with the disaster, but she turns on the alert in the film, whereas she has testified otherwise. Instead, we are made to see the heroics of the crew unvarnished. We watch the craziness of the explosion, and as I said before, Williams's exploits here are probably exaggerated a little too much. That's all that really affects the narrative, but there are a few minor inaccuracies I want to point out. Williams wasn't given a dinosaur tooth from the well, which in the movie he manages to take off the rig for his daughter, symbolically completing the story. That's completely fictional. The well is shown kind of giving some leaks through the bedrock, through CG bubbles, but that could not have happened. This is purely for dramatic effect, but it could lead to some misconceptions about the way this blowout happened. I wish they had shown that there were some students fishing below the rig. They were on their way back to shore when the explosion happened, and so they had front row seats to the disaster, and could have easily been hurt by the explosion. After everyone makes it safely to the nearby ship, the crew kneels in prayer. This happened the following day because they were too busy tending to their casualties. And that's about all there is. All in all, not too bad. The demonization of one guy and the over-glorification of the crew is a little off-putting, but it doesn't hinder the plot too much. The movie is fast-paced fun and does not wear its welcome by taking more than 2 hours. By focusing on the rig explosion by itself rather than the disaster as a whole, it manages to tell a realistic, human-level story, just as a good history film should.